Welcome to Beyond the Headlines with Al Nguli, ladies and gentlemen. This is where we get into a deeper look into interesting things, people and news events from Nagaland and of course from India and across the world. You can watch us every Sunday at 7:30. Now I've got a story for you. My mother used to narrate stories about how the Doyang River in Wokha district used to have not just big or large fish, but gigantic fish those days, gigantic. It would be in the late 70s or early 80s, I think. That's before the Doyang Hydro project came into being. Now, a small detail from mom's stories has always stuck with me. It seems there was one type of extremely large fish that my dad and my grandfather used to bring home from their fishing trips. Now, she said she has not seen that type of fish ever since. So this fish was extremely large, that it could be carried only slung across a person's shoulders like this. So I asked my mom if it might even be catfish, which can grow to 3 meters long and may even weigh more than 300 kilograms. Or I asked her, maybe it was a dolphin. Dolphins can weigh from about 40 kilograms to even 200 kilograms. And if you're laughing about me mentioning dolphins, dolphins can be found in Assam's rivers. You know that. So anyway, it was neither a dolphin or a catfish, because my mom knows both catfish and dolphins. She said this type of fish were called jamva in Lotha. Interesting, jamva is the name Lothas use for large fish such as whales or extremely large types of aquatic creatures. Interestingly, the closest fish that resembled her description was this, a porpoise or even a beluga whale. And they both look like this, which you see on the screen, and this. Porpoises and beluga whales have a bulbous rounded head and a torpedo-shaped body. Interestingly, I read online that there actually is one porpoise species that live or used to live in the northeast Indian region or somewhere close, particularly in the northern Bay of Bengal. That is the Indo-Pacific finless porpoise, very large fish. Then, interestingly, my mom told me that sometimes we can see this type of fish on Discovery Channel on TV. So, what if Nagaland had whales or sharks or porpoises in those days, but our ancestors didn't know? By our standards, seeing a porpoise or a shark in Nagaland would be akin to finding a Naga astronaut somewhere. We rarely even see a fully grown catfish anymore. Now, I'm not saying that our fathers used to fish whales from Doyang River, or maybe there were. I'm just saying that there might be unknown species of large fish or even small whales during those times, and we just didn't know it. I'm just saying that the Naga people may have had an exceptionally long list of flora and fauna they consumed or destroyed into extinction over the past many decades. Broadly speaking, wildlife academics and documentation cultures, by its definition, came to Nagaland only in the mid-80s. Now, for comparison, Nagaland University was inaugurated only in 1994. Now, generally though, a large part of our natural wealth has still yet to be discovered. We can only imagine how many yet unknown, undocumented or undiscovered flora and fauna we might be destroying or consuming. This may include even those species, animals, plants that might be still new to science. On March 13th, the Wildlife Crime Control Unit of Dimapur summoned for questioning a person by the name Kepen Hulo Kemp. Did I get that right? Kepen Hulo Kemp. Mr. Kemp is a YouTube user who also goes by the channel's handle Roving Naga. He was summoned for offenses of hunting and consuming protected wildlife. The wildlife authorities summoned him for violation of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. The first summon was issued on March 6, 2025, directing him to report to the authorities. Now, according to the second summon issued by the officer in charge of the Wildlife Crime Unit on March 11th, Mr. Kemp did not appear before the authorities as he was directed. Now, following his refusal to comply with a summons, the authorities spelled out these offenses that he allegedly committed. 1. Hunting and consumption of a protected water snake called the checkered keelback. 2. Creating and sharing content on hunting and consumption. And 3. Creating and sharing content on hunting and consumption of birds. Now, the authorities say that the checkered keelback is protected by the Wildlife Act. It's written there. The state government had declared a blanket ban on hunting of all Schedule I species in all non-government land. Now, therefore, the Wildlife Authority stated Mr. Kemp has been found to have violated the law. He was directed to appear before the establishment on March 17. At this time, the YouTuber was said to have been punished with a hefty fine. I haven't seen the order yet. Interestingly, though, he was also in the news for the wrong reasons earlier. A tribal organization had pulled him up allegedly for hurting the sentiments of the tribe earlier. He had allegedly named a puppy after a major festival of that tribe. Now, when the news about the summons to the YouTuber broke and the reported penalty that was imposed on him, there was a surge of both support and condemnation. There were people who lauded the authorities, people who didn't, and people who had arguments that leaned on the merits of the case. So what do you think? Did the law serve justice for the snake and the birds that were killed and eaten? Or are there elements to the Naga story that represents a gamut of Nagaland's struggle with conservation? Now, before we discuss this aspect of the whole case, let's have a look at the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and what it says. The Wildlife Protection Act is an act of the Parliament of India that protects certain plants and birds and animal species across the country. The Act has 6 specific schedules that provide varying degrees of protection to the species. Now, the YouTuber was penalized for offenses under Schedule 1. Schedule 1 and Part 2 of Schedule 2 provide the highest level of protection for the species. Species listed in Schedule 3 and Schedule 4, again, are also protected, but the penalties are much lower than those for Schedule 1 species. And again, animals under Schedule 5 are also legally considered vermin, and you may hunt them freely. Anyway, so we'll talk about Schedule 1. What is Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Act? The act under which the YouTuber Mr. Kemp got himself on the wrong side of the jungle. So this is what we'll be discussing. The schedule is for endangered species only. They are accorded the highest level of protection and have the harshest penalty force. You cannot harm any of the species under any circumstance unless, of course, there is a threat to human life. Now, among them is the water snake, the checkered keelback, which found itself in Mr. Kemp's cooking pot. There's a whole lot of animals listed as endangered and protected in the Act. Nagaland has its own list. There's the hulok gibbon, a large species of gibbon that is found in the hill forest and also disappearing due to hunting and rapid deforestation. We also have the Asiatic black bear. Maybe we have 1 or 2 of them left in our forest somewhere in Kohima. There's also the Chinese pangolin found in Parent district, and one of the 4 globally endangered species of the armored animal. Again, we have the often hunted wild boar, the porcupine, the barking deer, civets, flying squirrels, and so on and forth. Now, there is a complex array of perspectives that this topic demands, ladies and gentlemen. For now, we'll just delve into the merits of the case related to the YouTuber Mr. Kemp and how this case might be the biggest enforcement action taken by the wildlife authorities in Nagaland in the recent years. Now, there are a lot of questions that people are raising. There were people who questioned the wildlife authorities for being selective. The video was from at least 7 months ago, if I read correctly. Now, they were questioning the authorities, what were you doing that time? They are unhappy that there is poor or no enforcement checks on them, but a YouTuber has been penalized. So that's not fair. That's what they're saying. Ministers and MLAs, they get exotic forest produce and meat all the time. Our daily markets have everything from pangolin scales to bee larvae. Numerous Nagas have been having a go at some strange meat or a bird or a plant at some point of the time or the other in our dinners, in our marketplaces. On the other side of the debate, again, are people who welcome the Wildlife Division's action. They felt that the action was a long time in the coming. Now, considering Nagaland's conservation discourse, both in action and promotion, I think the whole issue of conservation seems to be woefully ineffective. Now, this group feels that our natural capital and conservation economic is a matter that the people and the government of Nagaland should approach with seriousness by policy and by enforcement. Now, there again were some people who defended Mr. Camp and some who stood for the government. Some fell back on the argument of cultural practices. Some called for adapting with the changing times and a more informed outlook about life. Still, some blame it on the lack of education and awareness. They pointed fingers at the general lack of empathy. Some blame it on the absence of educated choices our people could have made, culture or no culture. So let's do this. First thing, to be fair, blaming the tribal people for killing and consuming endangered animals without understanding their protected status requires a very nuanced perspective, ladies and gentlemen. Cultural traditions, socioeconomic conditions, and educational limitations, yes, they play key roles in such actions. For generations, Naga communities in Nagaland have relied on hunting as a means of livelihood, a means of sustenance, which again is also tied to their cultural identity. Animals are often integral to traditional practices, festivals, principles of life, peace and war, and their social philosophy here. Another factor here is that the distinction between common wildlife and endangered species may be unclear to most people due to the absence of their exposure or awareness to conservation efforts or the New World mindsets. Again, from the socioeconomic standpoint, rural communities in Nagaland face limited access to alternative food sources. They rely heavily on forest resources for survival. This dependence, combined with poverty, often leaves them with very few options but to hunt for sustenance or trade from forest products from the jungles. So it's both a food source and a livelihood for many people in the rural areas, meaning the practice overlaps into areas where hunting is accepted as a sport because killing has been accepted as a means of sustenance. So that's the whole link between cultural identity and their socioeconomic status too. Again, unfortunately, educational challenges further worsen the situation. While conservation awareness is improving among the people, it is only addressing the symptoms, not the disease. A lot of people, especially in the isolated regions, may still lack adequate knowledge about endangered species or the legal consequences of harming them, for instance. Without a targeted outreach, the government of Nagaland expecting these communities to distinguish between protected animals from other common usable animals is extremely unrealistic. It will be so for most people. I'm sure Mr. Camp had absolutely no idea whether or not the birds or snake he killed were endangered. I grew up hunting and fishing too, but couldn't tell the difference between an endangered bird or a coffee machine. I strongly feel Mr. Camp wouldn't know, as most of us. But I repeat, not to defend him, but I repeat, to be fair, the plea of ignorance, the lack of conservation awareness, or even cultural practices still does not change the fact that the law was broken. Whether or not we like it, the law exists. It is true, and I agree that our wildlife establishment may not be paragons of virtue. They certainly aren't always wearing their socks on, because come on, who hasn't seen a pangolin or a deer on our tables? But the wildlife division was just doing its job. And as an authority, they are expected to act on evidence. They are not the police or the National Investigation Agency that raid on suspicion or rumors. They are an implementing agency that works on the evidence at hand. Unfortunately, Mr. Camp's violation of the law was publicly documented evidence. And I am sure if all of us citizens were to report to the authorities the exotic meat and birds we see in the market, then I think the authorities will also act on it. That said, it will be great if the establishment would also create a surveillance system that keeps a check on our markets and among our communities. This method can be a combination of manpower and technology, including a public reporting system. Now, rather than placing blame, a more effective approach would need the involvement of education, alternative livelihood programs, and community-based conservation strategies that respect cultural practices while also protecting endangered species. Now, this action demands the contribution of both the community and the government. Second, local cultural practices or premises of tradition cannot justify the killing of endangered animals in any way in these times and age. While cultural traditions and a lack of awareness may explain such actions, they still do not provide legal or ethical immunity here. Like it or not, we have laws that protect us as much as it protects others. Now, regardless of intent, harming protected animals undermines conservation efforts, and they certainly disturb fragile ecosystems. Now, even if an animal is not protected, say common frogs or even bees you see in the market, wanton consumption will lead to their extinction that will have irreversible impact on our lives. It's the difference between need and excess. Third, I do agree that we need to move forward, adapting with the changing times. There has to be order in the society because every word and action is tied into someone else's life who will have to absorb the impact from the consequences of your choices. Now, through education and maybe even emphatic farsightedness for most people about nature or conservation laws may be limited, yes, but let's put it this way. If you are someone who is not educated about the environment or its laws, but you are still someone who understands and appreciates the value of the environment or nature, you would need to know if a bird or a fish or a snake is endangered or is worth killing. Likewise, if you are someone who knows all the endangered species in the world and the laws about them and you're educated in it, but if you also eat anything you can grab hold of, you are still going to kill them, endangered or not. So it's not so much about being aware or being culturally inclined. It's not even about love or hate for meat. It's not even about laws or conservation enforcement here. It's not even about education and ignorance. It's all about having empathy and a greater understanding for the role nature in play in our life, without having for us to overuse these gifts, these resources. On this understanding depends our choices whether or not we are going to be random with everything that can be digested. Likewise, it's also about restraint and making educated choices that accommodate nature. Every plant and animal plays an important role in the greater scheme of things in our lives. The problem starts when we become wanton and random with food. Punitive measures and penalty alone may be counterproductive here. It won't be helpful. We cannot penalize one person and ignore the open markets, the exotic gifts and the dinners at home. That's unfair for the people, for the government to expect. Yet again, we also cannot expect the government alone, as woefully ill-equipped and undermanaged as it is, to be everywhere unless citizens are also contributing to the work of the authorities. Instead, we need to find the sweet spot where we have a balance of both community action and government enforcement working together. Otherwise, it will be like our infamous Liquor Prohibition Act. We hide from checkposts, but our pawn shops are selling whiskey. It will be like that. We need an approach that combines strong government enforcement, community involvement in conservation and awareness campaigns, and sustainable livelihood alternatives and practices. Now, pour into that mix responsible food consumption behavior from our citizens, from us. And we just might have at least a working society that allows protection of natural resources without depriving the community and their needs. Engaging tribal leaders and integrating traditional ecological knowledge into conservation efforts can also foster greater understanding and cooperation here. Now again, bring into that mix our youths and our students, the educated ones. And just maybe the health and future of our flora and fauna will look much better if we all work together. Yes, the law must be upheld, but addressing the underlying cultural and socioeconomic factors is crucial to ensuring long-term wildlife protection in Nagaland, ladies and gentlemen. Efforts that empower communities to embrace conservation as part of their identity will be far more effective than relying solely on penalties and enforcement. Thank you for watching Hornbill TV. I'm Al Ngali. See you next time.